This is Mai Kue, and you are listening to The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. This is a podcast that is dedicated to stories and tellings of my spiritual experiences. Some of the stories I will be sharing will cover many topics such as the parallels in spirituality and mental health, ghost stories, dreams, tarot reading, mediumship, and more. I do want to provide a disclaimer that these are all just based on my personal experiences. I do not have any certification in spiritual healing or mental health therapy, nor do I have an altar to practice Hmong shamanistic healing or rituals. Many of the stories I will be sharing are based purely on my personal experiences and how I have made sense of them throughout the years. So to those who are listening to this podcast, I hope that you will enjoy my stories and join me on the narrow path in the floating mountains.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry, you were right. Just leave me be, I'm not gonna put up a fight.
Welcome, listeners, to the first episode of The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. For this episode being the first one, I thought, what better way to start off than to just do an introduction to who I am, also why I started this podcast, and the explanation of the title. I thought that explaining the title a little bit more would kind of like be a great way for you all to just kind of know what my intentions are with the podcast. So without further ado, I will just jump right into an introduction about who I am. I am a mother, a wife, and I have a dog. And much of my life revolves around these three people. And my main job, the main job that I do, is I actually have a studio where I make art and I do tattoos. And so I'm self-employed, and then my husband, he works for the local city library. And so the podcast is really just something that I wanted to do to have an outlet to talk about just kind of like these two things that I'm very passionate about, which is spirituality and mental health. And really having this outlet helps me to just put all my thoughts together and just kind of like talk and reflect. Sometimes what helps me is to just talk out loud and be able to formulate or gather thoughts around that. And so that's kind of like a process that I do for even things that I'm struggling with. But again, I'm just really passionate about these two things. And so kind of like segueing into why I started this podcast. It's mainly to have an outlet to talk about these two topics that I just really enjoy talking about. And I oftentimes find myself coming back to these topics, even in conversation with my clients. Whether it's spirituality or mental health, I find that for me, spirituality and mental health are very intertwined. The other spirituality is something that helps me to be more reflective and conscious, whereas the mental health aspect of it helps me to be grounded and be aware of how physical circumstances have impacted me throughout my journey, and how it's led me to my own healing. And so for me, I always find myself coming back to those two things that are very important to me. And I find that those are also the two things that people kind of come back to in terms of processing their struggles and the things that they're dealing with. For me, spirituality, I don't really stick to one way of believing. I'm typically like to tell people that I'm very fluid in my understanding of spirituality. And so in that sense, I find myself like being able to relate to a multitude of people and clients, and just really being open and being a good listener, that not only do I gain a lot from the people who I have conversations about with, whether it's like spirituality or mental health, but in conversation too, if there are things that I feel obviously asking for permission, if it's okay for me to share, that sharing certain things that I've experienced may sometimes help someone to see their situation from a different perspective without minimizing like what they're dealing with. And so I find myself like doing that with other people too. And so I thought about like, well, I do this on a daily basis. How can I have another outlet to formulate, or I guess like consolidate my thoughts and reflect? And so that's kind of what my intentions are with this podcast. It's a culmination of what I have collected, what I'm still trying to make sense of, and kind of like how to move forward based on my, I guess, like spiritual or mental health journey. It stems from also, I guess, like the intention with creating this podcast too is that I find myself trying to hold on to my heritage and my roots, my cultural roots, in ways that help me to thrive as a Hmong woman. I have a very complicated relationship with my cultural like roots, and that a lot of the things that traditions within the Hmong culture are, in a way, it's very limiting and doesn't allow for a lot of Hmong women to thrive. And so I, again, just having a very complicated relationship with my roots, my heritage, I've slowly started chipping away at like, how can I still maintain a sense of like being connected to my heritage and my roots. And I found that spirituality, Hmong spirituality, and the ways that we think about spirituality, accessing it, and also navigating it, is something that is very much a part of how I came to understand spirituality in general. And so one way for me to be in touch with my cultural roots is through spirituality. And I feel that there's an interesting thing that happens in the Hmong culture too, is that Hmong people or Hmong individuals in my generation who are also trying to unpack their trauma, their family's trauma, and generational trauma, is that we're finding that there's not a lot of ways for us to traditionally anyways, to unpack trauma and talk about mental health. And so some of the things that we've been finding is that we use spirituality to help us unpack trauma and basically talk about mental health, but in using spiritual metaphors or spiritual like happenings to unpack like depression, or talk about trauma or even things that happen to us that we can't explain. Sometimes too, in a very toxic way, spirituality has been used to the advantage of the perpetrator and the abuser, and unfortunately that's kind of like the thing that is very disheartening about some people who are very connected to their cultural, spiritual roots, however you say it, or that their experience with their culture's spiritual roots causes that traumatic, is a part of that trauma that it's hard for them to even find an aspect of like spirituality that they can participate in. I guess like that's just kind of the thing that I find is always like a paradox in cultures, right? Cultures having these things where sometimes tradition, and I guess like tradition can be used to perpetrate. I'm realizing I'm still just in like the first few minutes of this episode, and the first episode just being the main introduction for the podcast. So another reason why I wanted to start this podcast is because I really just wanted to share my stories too, as a form of entertainment for some people. I know I really enjoy listening to people's stories, spiritual stories, or their ghost stories. For me, I listen to them to try to like piece apart like why things happen, and what causes like things to happen, and then just trying to like make sense of it, because I think for me, I'm constantly trying to make sense of the spiritual but also the mental health part of it, so that I guess that's just my the way that I have taught myself to process like things that just don't really have an explanation for, right? So that's why I listen to other people's stories, but I also just really like hearing about people's spiritual experiences, but also paranormal experiences, but also like how they've been able to get to where they are in their healing. Another thing too is that maybe these stories become a resource to others to help them make sense of their own spiritual journey, right? In the same ways that I listen to other people's story to try and make sense of like my own journey or what I'm dealing with, that the stories that I share can be a way for you listeners, the listeners, to make sense of their own experiences. And I feel like within the Hmong culture too, spirituality can sometimes be very black and white, and then sometimes it's very gray too. And so as a resource, it can help people to just try to like figure it out on their own through like just listening. I know that there are some folks in the community that feel like, oh, you shouldn't be listening to many stories because that's going to make you crazy, or that's going to make you think too much. But I think that if it helps them in a way that isn't going to be harmful, then I think it's okay to be receptive. But as I always say too in my tarot readings, so I do tarot readings too, is to tell people to take what resonates and leave the rest. Like if it doesn't resonate with you, or it's like, oh, it wasn't this, then you don't have to take in everything. But then also being very respectful and not saying, oh, this person's like fake, or this person's like, just taking in what somebody else, or they're just whatever, like kind of like discrediting someone's experience, someone's journey that's obviously helped them. I think being obviously like respectful to So that's what I hope that these stories can become a resource to some people. And then of course like just purely entertainment. And then the other thing that I kind of mentioned too is that this podcast would be a way for me to have an outlet to talk about my experiences with mental health healing and how it parallels with my beliefs and spiritual practices. Just really having an outlet. I think having an outlet helps you to unload and unpack on your own terms rather than loading off on, you know, close family members or random people. I think that having an outlet in ways that obviously make you feel comfortable, it can be helpful too. You know, if there are things that I'm not comfortable sharing publicly, like I just won't share them. That's kind of what I see with this podcast too. It's in a way like safe enough, but also being cautious too. I mentioned this too at the beginning that I wanted to use this podcast as a way to reflect and talk out loud about my experiences, to just kind of like think out loud. Really, that's just what it is to think out loud. Being able to do so can help me to consolidate ideas, or if it sounds ridiculous out loud, then I know like, oh my gosh, you know, you're going off tangent, like that doesn't make any more sense, then I can leave that thought. Yeah, and then the other thing too is just like spirituality and mental health being two topics that I'm very passionate about. It has equally been something that has become a part of my daily routine rituals. Again, I always find myself coming back to that. This is, again, just something that I'm really passionate about that I wanted to share, and I wanted to consolidate it into a podcast format. So for the next part of this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the explanation behind the title. I felt that it would be an important part to this episode or even to this podcast because in a way the title is a metaphor of just what I guess like how I see my healing journey, and just kind of like how it is not only a metaphor for spiritual healing but also mental health. And again, as I mentioned, I see them both as intertwined. They are in ways either working with each other, or I know I mentioned parallels, and parallel lines never like connect, but in a way they work hand in hand and side by side. If it is something that I would like to how I explain it in a spiritual sense to some people, I sometimes refer back to like ideologies within mental health that I am familiar with. And so they're in a way very connected. And the title of this podcast can be seen as like a literal metaphor of my mental health journey. And so the first thing in the title that most people probably resonate with is the idea of the path. And when we think about the path, we're thinking about a straight line or a road or just a way to follow so that you know where you're heading, right? So for many of us, we just want to know where we're headed. And oftentimes we use the metaphor of the path to talk about even our journey, right? And so for me, this idea of the path is just like a metaphor of my experience in healing in all aspects of my life. I then wanted to connect this idea of the path with like, how does it look like, right? What kind of a path could this look like? And to help others to visualize like, okay, what's this path? What does her path look like? And for me, I see my path as a very narrow path. Not because like it's narrow because it's a very defined and a very tight space to navigate or to stay on, but more so in the sense of like oftentimes it will feel very small, very narrow, very almost like, I'm trying to find a word for it, claustrophobic. It's so much so that you kind of feel like there's no room to deviate from that path, that sometimes it does feel narrow. But the idea with it being narrow too is that it's okay to veer off, because narrow paths, it's just impossible to try and stay on. Sometimes it's okay to really stick to it and try to stay within the boundaries or the confines of that path, and stay focused. And sometimes in areas of the path where it's narrow and weak, that sometimes when we veer off of it, by way of just how things have like blocked the road or just obstacles within the road, that it's okay to veer off and still come back to it. And so this idea of my path being narrow isn't so much so that it is it's so narrow that I can't veer off of it. It's more so that it's narrow and that it's okay to veer off of it because of the fact that it's narrow, right? Because of the fact that it's intended to be narrow in some areas, maybe. It might just be that it's more narrow in some areas, and in other areas it's wider. But that even when we feel that the walls are closing in and it's hard for us to move between these walls, that in some areas, that when you do veer off or you do mess up, that it's okay to just forgive yourself and continue to find your way back on this path. And so I mean, essentially it's just kind of like you can't always expect to stay on such a narrow path. Sometimes you have to veer off of it because of the obstacles or because of the things that will force you to delay your journey, right? And so that's the idea with like the narrow path. I know someone might argue that, you know, seeing the path as narrow is just kind of like limiting, but who's to say like you have to limit yourself to a narrow path that exists, but to deviate from that, right? It's also a way for me to open up the idea of this path as still being able to deviate from it, right? Because in society, like, we deviate from societal standards, because there's no real sense of like these standards. They exist in the like conscious bubble or this kind of like intangible bubble of thoughts, but who's to say like we have to stick to it, right? And so that was the idea with the narrow path, my path being narrow, because it is very easy to veer off of the path, but it is also okay to get back on, so long as the quote-unquote narrow path is still in view and you are aware that in these dark night of the soul moments, you can use your light, whatever sense of like self-guidance that you call upon can guide you back on that path. And so that is why I saw this title, and in describing what this path looks like, I saw it as like a narrow path. The other thing to the title was why floating, right? Why floating mountains? And I want to separate the idea of floating from mountains, because it could be one and the same, but I find that the idea of floating is very specific to my, just like how I've made sense of this idea or this concept of floating. And so for me, like, my first encounter with this idea of floating and theory or philosophy, floating as theory and philosophy in art was in Asian art. So my background is in art, specifically art education and fibers and textiles art. And I did a ton of research into Hmong textiles, just technique wise, and then understanding like garment. But I also had taken some courses. I had like a minor in art history focusing on Chinese art. And I don't quite remember a ton about Chinese art, but I've been able to pick up some things here and there. And one of the things that I picked up was this idea of like the floating mountains in ink paintings. And even though it's not Chinese art, the idea of the floating world is a concept that's connected to Japanese ukiyo prints. And so I know they're both very separate ideas, but just kind of like how the idea of the floating world and kind of seeing it through, understanding it through Japanese prints, and then applying that to my understanding of like ink paintings, Chinese ink paintings, and then eventually into this idea of like spirituality. That's kind of where the idea of floating stems from, and that it's literal but also used as a tool to understand like another idea, if that makes sense. So in just kind of like background information for those who are like, I don't know anything about art. So in Japanese ukiyo prints, if you've ever seen like Japanese art, you'll see that a lot of it is prints of like interior spaces with people in these spaces. And you'll notice that it's always from a specific perspective, right? From a bird's eye view. And it's always as if you took the ceiling off of a roof and you're looking into like this interior space. And so because the focus is on this interior space, you get little information about the environment outside of like this building or this structure. And so when you're looking down, it almost looks as if like this house or this structure that you're looking into is floating. It also looks like the figures are floating in the space, because there's no real sense of like a line that tells you like it's a solid ground. And so oftentimes you just see it as figures like floating in these spaces. And so art historians, I don't know how far back this idea goes, but art historians kind of connected it, they utilized the idea of like the floating world in relation to like the style of art from this Japanese prints. And so understanding that, I kind of like make that connection with like Chinese ink paintings, even though it's not anything, there's no relation at all. In that I started thinking of this idea of like floating figures, floating things, almost like spiritual beings, right? And looking at Chinese ink paintings of huge landscapes, right? Mountains that look like they're floating in the clouds. I thought about like, like this to me looks more like a floating world, wherein these very heavy, dense like landscapes just seem like they're floating. And the intention with depicting these mountains as if they're floating in the clouds is that the artist is trying to depict these landscapes as like very powerful in the spiritual sense, but also having in a way this illusion of what the heavens might look like, right? Like trying to emulate this sense of the heavenly planes, while like observing and looking at physical like landscapes. And so there's this kind of like back and forth when you're looking at Chinese ink paintings of, is this real, or is this from the artist's perspective, or like is this just like, I guess, like their way of mirroring landscapes in a way that tells a story or is complementary to a poem, right? So when you are looking at these Chinese ink paintings, they do look like they're floating. And oftentimes these ink paintings are accompanied with poems. Some of these poems are either Confucius poems or just poems about nature, or about the spirit of the land, and in a way seeing these mountains or these landscapes in the paintings as like the figures, because a lot of times these ink paintings don't have people in it, because the people who are in it are actually the mountains, right? The spirit, the living things, they are the mountains. And so with the idea of the floating, it stems from like these two thoughts that I've kind of created on my own to make sense of like the artwork that I'm viewing, but also something that actually really exists in art theory. And so just to kind of talk a little bit about floating, but that's kind of why floating. The other thing in the title is mountains, right? And I wanted to separate floating and mountains, even though I talk a lot about floating mountains, as it relates to the idea of floating mountains or floating world. But mountains for me has also a very specific connection, symbolism tied to not only Chinese art, but to my cultural heritage, like the Hmong, right? There's a very, very important, it's very important to Hmong people, right? A huge part of our culture and way of living revolved around mountainside like villages, living on mountains, right? We're known as hill tribe people. And so mountains in themselves have a very powerful and important meaning in our culture. We have it in our embroidery. We use it as a way of protection, right? Existing along the natural environment on these mountainsides or hillsides. We use it as agriculture for our rice paddies, and again, like protection, right? In hiding, kind of enmeshing ourselves with the environment, the forests on the mountainsides, because like we have such a long history of moving from one region to another. And I could go on and on and talk about spirituality among people, but and spirituality in relation to like the land in our culture, but I'm gonna save that for another episode. But mountains in themselves like possess a lot of spiritual meaning in the Hmong culture and in general in many cultures, right? It is a very grand and powerful entity in itself, right? An example was just how in Chinese ink paintings they valued these images of mountains. in a way, they are enlivened with spiritual entities, benevolent, malicious, and helpful, or merciless, right? So we view mountains as not only having like people as residents, right? For example, Hmong people, but the Hmong people also believe that within the forests and jungles of the mountains, there exists other spirits that meander and roam the mountainside. And so we also believe that there is I'm trying to find a word for it. It's kind of like the landlord of the land. So how we describe them is they're 𝙏𝙗𝙚, right? They are the owners of the land. They oversee the land. They are the guardians of the land. And they protect the land from humans and from other entities. And so mountains in the south are, even though they seem to be very static, that they're alive, right? I again wanted to utilize mountains as a part of my title because I also think about when the elders, they talk about just seeing the mountains from far away, that they're kind of taken back to memories. It also provides them with a sense of like almost being so close to the heavens, right? When they're viewing the mountains, that in a way it's like the closest thing that you will experience to the heavens or the other side, the spiritual world, right? Of seeing it with your own eyes. It not only brings a sense of serenity and peace, but also a respect for the land, a reminder that the world is a lot bigger than we tend to experience it. I also wanted to use mountains as a part of this title because it has a very specific connection to spirituality, in the sense of like people who are rising to become shamans, or just have like a spiritual gift. And so the mountains have a connection in Hmong folklore to spirituality, wherein when someone who is beginning their path of shamanism, it is said that having vivid or lucid dreams of flying over mountains is a strong indication that you have the gift of traveling between, navigating the spiritual world. It's a strong indication of traveling into the spiritual world to be able to navigate it. And that's something that is one of like I actually didn't know this until like later on, that this is something that is like a telltale sign that someone has that gift or the ability. But I feel that many of us, we have that ability to navigate between the waking world and the spiritual world. It's just a matter of how someone can like recall that, or someone is capable of having like lucid dreams, or being conscious of the fact that they're dreaming, right? Being able to control things in their dreams. And so the idea of the mountains too comes from this reference. And it is not to suggest that the stories I tell assume that I am on the path of being a shaman. I don't claim that at all. I've been told, but I'm like, I kind of feel like again, going back to like the mental health part, or the more like philosophical part of it is that we all have like these experiences that can be explained. Sometimes they can't be explained, but more so that there's a I guess like more psychological explanation for being able to have these dreams or have these experiences. And it comes down to being able to assess like my mental health, my emotional mental health, and how that relates to like my spiritual experiences. But much of what I share are just, again, accounts of my personal experiences that I have been able to make sense of as I listen to other people's stories too. And so I have, in a way, just like glean information from just stories of people who have spiritual experiences, as well as some shamans. I mean, there's this like really awesome channel called Tomorrow Hmong where he interviews like shamans and their journeys, and so I kind of like listen to their stories so that it can help me make sense of like what I'm going through. And a lot of them, they talk a lot about their emotional and mental health too, and how that connects to their spiritual journey or spiritual growth. I share it and I listen for that specific reason, is that I'm very connected to my spirituality, but how does it affect, or how does it impact, or how can it help me like process my emotional health? I think too, a lot of people, they're not aware of it, but they use spirituality to find a sense of belonging, and making sense of the things that they've experienced. For example, like some people, they have a really strong faith in the church, to help them find grace, right? Help them find a path, or help them to find a sense of peace, or a way to handle their emotional mental health. And so I see it that way, not so much as like finding a specific religion to help me with my emotional mental health, but spirituality in general. So in a similar manner, I have my experiences, how I share my experiences, that it in some ways becomes a resource for those who are open to hearing, and are just looking for something to help them make sense of their own personal experiences and healing journey. And so that's kind of like the reason why. I think I mentioned this too earlier, but I believe in the idea that the more you are familiar or comfortable with talking about spirituality and mental health, that it makes it a little easier to feel empowered to do the unpacking of your trauma, as well as overcoming some of the difficult experiences by using like the spiritual or mental health to be able to overcome like these crisis situations that someone may be experiencing. There's a lot that I want to share for this podcast, and building up my episodes to spread out the stories and try to organize them based on themes or similar subject matter to make it easier to go back to for folks who are wanting to or interested in joining me on this journey of just listening to my stories. And so hopefully I am able to do that, but I do feel like this is something that I want to stick to. I've attempted to do mini podcasts before. One was like storytelling, one was like talking about art, one was just talking about who I am, and I never really found like the middle ground for it. And so hopefully this is something that can stick and that for those who are listening that you will stick around. With that said, I hope that you will join me on this journey with this podcast as I share a piece of myself and I hold near and dear to my heart with you. And that concludes this episode of The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tune in for the next one coming out soon.